In this course, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to get started programming in Python. Now, Python is one of the most popular programming languages out there, and it's by far one of the most sought after for jobs. And so if you're trying to get a job, or you're trying to, automate your life, or you're trying to write awesome scripts to do a bunch of different things, then Python's for you. Honestly, more and more developers every day are moving their projects over to Python because it's such a powerful and it's such an easy to use language. A lot of programming languages out there just aren't very beginner friendly. There's a lot of syntax, there's a lot of little things that if you get wrong, the program will yell at you. Python is the complete opposite of that. You basically just type out what you want to do and Python does it. It's that simple. There's not a whole lot of syntax to learn. The learning curve is literally zero. You jump in, you can start writing your first program in seconds. In this course, I'm going to teach you guys everything you need to know to get started in Python. I designed this course especially for Python, and each lesson has been specially designed with examples that will help you along the way. With so many people starting to learn Python, the question isn't why should you learn Python? The question is why shouldn't you? And I think for a lot of people, the reason they might not want to learn Python is because they're intimidated or they're afraid that it's going to be too hard. Trust me, I am going to hold your hand through this entire course. We're going to talk about all the core concepts in Python. We're going to look at everything you need to know to start programming in Python and start being confident and start writing scripts and start writing programs that are awesome and doing cool things in your life. Anyway, I'm super pumped to be teaching you guys Python. I can't wait to get started in this course, and I hope you guys stick around and follow along with the course and learn this amazing programming language. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to install Python onto your computer. And we're also going to install a text editor that we can use to write our Python programs in. So the first order of business is to actually install Python on your computer. So what we want to do is head over to our web browser, and you want to go over here to this page. It's just www.python.org/downloads. And on this page, there's going to be two buttons down here, and it's just going to say download Python 3.6.3. And at least that's the version that I have right now, or download Python 2.7.14. So here's the thing about Python. There's actually two major versions of Python that are in use currently. There's Python 2 and there's Python 3. So you can see over here, this is like 2.7.14. Basically any Python 2 version we would just refer to as like Python 2. And here's like the latest Python 3 version. And so there's these two versions that you can download, and the first thing we have to decide is which version do we want to download. And here's the basic difference. Python 2 is a legacy version of Python, which basically means that it's like an old version and it's not being like actively maintained or supported like officially by Python anymore. Python 3 is like the future of Python. It's like the newest version. It's the one that's getting actively maintained and supported. And so there's pros and cons to picking either one. A lot of people will say like Python 2 has been around longer, and so there's more like libraries. There's basically just more Python code written in Python 2. And so therefore, like there's a few more things that you can do in Python 2 than you can do in Python 3. But then again, Python 2 is not supported, and 5 or 10 years from now, probably no one's going to be using it. Python 3, like I said, is like the future of Python. It's the newest version. It's the one that, is sort of being maintained going forward. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you guys Python 3. So we're going to want to download Python 3. Now, here's the thing. Like, if you learn Python 3 or you learn Python 2, the differences aren't very big. There are a few differences in like some syntax and just some, little things here and there. But if you learn Python 3, you'll be able to jump right in and code in Python 2 as well. Don't let anyone, tell you that you have to learn one or the other. We're going to learn Python 3 just because it's, I think, probably the best for a beginner to learn. And so that's the one that we want to download. So I'm just going to click download Python 3, and we're going to go ahead and download this version. And when that's done downloading, I'm just going to head down to my downloads folder. And you'll see here, we just have this file. I'm just going to double click, and we get this like Python installer. So I'm just going to click through here, and we'll be able to install Python 3 on our computer. All right, when that's done installing, we can just close out of this, and we should be good to go. So now we have Python 3 installed on our computer. The next step is we need to choose a text editor. So we're going to be writing a bunch of code. So we're going to need some, environment or some program that we can write all that code in. And really, you can write Python in any text editor. You could write it in like Notepad or TextEdit. It doesn't really matter. But there are special text editors that are designed just for writing Python code. And these are called IDEs, and that stands for Integrated Development Environment. It's basically just a special environment where we can, run and execute our Python code, and it'll, basically like tell us how we're doing. So if we're, if we write something that's wrong or we have errors, it'll kind of point us in the right direction of what we need to do to fix that stuff. So in this course, we're going to be using an IDE, and one of my favorites and one of the most popular IDEs for Python is called PyCharm. So I'm over here on this website. It's called jetbrains.com/PyCharm. And this is the IDE that we're going to be using in this course. So I'm just going to come over here and click this big download now button. And we'll go ahead and download this PyCharm program. All right, so I'm getting this page over here. You can see there's two versions of PyCharm. One is a professional version, and that one's like paid, so you have to pay for it. But then there's this community version down here, and that's free and open source. So I'm just going to download this one, and this should have everything we need to get started using Python. All right, when that finishes downloading, I'm just going to pull that up in my downloads folder. And again, we can just sort of run this guy. And I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to have to drag it over to my applications folder. All right, so we now have PyCharm and we have Python 3 installed on our computer. So we're ready to start programming in Python. In this tutorial, we're going to create our first Python program, and we're going to be able to run it and see how everything works. The first thing I want to do is open up PyCharm. So PyCharm was the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment, that we downloaded in the last tutorial. So I'm just going to go ahead and search for it on my computer, and I can just open it up. And when we first open up PyCharm, we should basically just get a window prompting us to create a project. So you can see that down here. Actually, the first thing I want to do though is come over here to configure, and I'm just going to click on preferences, and I actually want to change the appearance. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a theme. So I just went over here to appearance and behavior, appearance, and I'm going to change the theme to Darkula, just because I think it's a little bit easier to use and look at. But you don't have to do that if you don't want to. And so down here, I'm just going to click Create New Project, and it's going to give us this little window right here, so I can just name my project, and I'm just going to name this Draft. And then there's this other option down here where it says Interpreter. Now, what we want to select is Python version 3. So if I click down here, you'll notice that there's a couple different options. So I'm on a Mac computer, and by default, Mac has Python version 2 installed on it. If you're on a Windows machine, I'm not sure if it does, but in this tutorial, we're going to be using Python 3. So you want to make sure that you have Python 3 selected as the interpreter. Otherwise, you might not be able to fully follow along with what we're doing in this video. So now I'm just going to come down here and click Create, and this is going to go ahead and create our project for us. All right, so now we have our Python project up and running, and I want to show you guys how we can create our first Python program. So over here in this draft folder, and this is just that project that we created, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to say New, and I'm going to come down and click Python file. So we want to create a new Python file. This will be our first Python program, and I can just give this a name. So why don't we just call this app, and I'm just going to click OK. All right, so now we have our first Python file open, and we can just start typing in some Python. So I want to show you guys just a very basic Python program, and this is just going to be a hello world program. So we're just going to print something out onto the screen. So what I want to do is I want to type out print, and I want to type in open and close parentheses. Now inside of this parentheses, we can make some quotation marks, and inside of the quotation marks, I'm just going to type out hello world. So this is like a very basic Python program. And what this is going to do is it's just going to print out hello world onto the screen. And so now what I can do is I can actually run this file, and we're actually getting a little error here. It wants us to create a new line at the end of the file. And so now in order to run our Python program, I'm just going to come up here to the top, and I'm just going to click run, and we'll click this run button right here. And now we'll see what happens. So it's asking me what I want to run. I can just click app, And down here at the bottom, you'll notice that we have this text that just got printed out, hello world. And so whatever I print or whatever I put inside of this print statement is going to get printed out down below in the console. So as long as you're getting that print statement to work, then you've actually written your first Python program. And as we go forward in the course, we're going to be writing all sorts of awesome Python programs, and we're going to be doing all sorts of cool stuff. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about writing a basic Python program. So we're going to write just a very simple Python program. We're going to look at how we can go ahead and write our programs. We're going to talk about how our programs are getting executed by Python. And we're also going to draw out a little shape onto the screen. So this is going to be pretty cool. I'm excited to talk to you guys about just the bare basics of Python and really just sort of give you an introduction. So over here, we have our basic text editor. And so any of the Python code that I write inside of this file is actually going to get executed by Python. So this Python file has a bunch of Python code inside of it. And basically what we're doing when we're programming in Python is we're just giving the computer a set of instructions, right? That's really what programming is. It's just like we're specifying a set of instructions and the computer is going to go off and execute those instructions that we give it. And so the more complex the instructions we give to the computer, the more complex the tasks the computer can carry out. So I want to show you guys how we can use some Python instructions or some Python code in order to draw out a shape onto the screen. So I'm actually going to draw out a little triangle. So over here, we can actually print something out onto the screen in Python using something called a print statement. So I can just type out print, and inside of these parentheses, I can just type some quotation marks, and inside the quotation marks, we can put whatever we want to print out onto the screen. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm actually going to make a few of these little print statements, and we're going to actually draw a shape. So we're going to draw like a triangle type shape. So down here, I'm just going to draw a forward slash, and then up here, I'll make a space, and we'll do another forward slash. Here, we'll make 2 spaces, we'll do another forward slash, and over here, we're going to make 3 spaces and a forward slash. And now I'm going to draw like vertical bars going all the way down. And actually, we can do some underscores here as well. That'd be kind of cool. All right, so now we have our triangle looking shape, and you can see it looks kind of like a right triangle. So I can save my file, and I can either come up here to run and click run app, or if you're using PyCharm, you can also just come over here and click this play button. And when I click the play button, I want you to notice what happens down here. So down here, we have this little window, and this is called the console. And basically, the console is just a place where Python is going to output some information. So when we use this print statement, we're basically telling Python, like, hey, can you print something out onto the console? So there's a lot of situations where we're going to want to see what's going on in our code. And we can use that print statement and print things out to the console, and we can basically like have a little window into what our program's doing. In our case, we're just going to be printing out this triangle onto the console. So I'm going to come over here and click this play button, and you'll see down here we're actually printing out that triangle. So mission accomplished, we were able to print out our shape. So I could really draw any shape I wanted as long as I was able to specify it inside of these print statements. And so essentially what Python's doing when I click that play button is it's going into this file and it's looking at all of these instructions in order. So the first thing it does is it goes to this instruction and it says, okay, they want me to draw out these like little forward slash and this vertical bar onto the screen. Once it does that, it goes down to this instruction. It says, okay, they want me to print something out again. When it prints that out, it goes down to this instruction, etc. So Python is actually going to execute the lines of code that we write in order. So the order in which I write the instructions matters a lot. So for example, if I was to take this last line here and put it up here at the top, now when I save the file, instead of just drawing out that triangle, it's going to draw out this little upside down bottom thing at the top and then the rest of the triangle down here. So the order of the instructions actually matters a lot. And so this is basically how your Python programs are going to go. As we go through this course, we're going to learn more and more of these little lines. So here we're just using this little print function. Basically, it just prints something out onto the screen. There's a bunch of little things like this that we can learn. And as we go through, we'll learn more and more instructions that we can give to the computer. But in this lesson, I just want to kind of show you guys the basics, right? We can essentially just define these little instructions for the computer, and the computer will execute them in order. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using variables in Python. Now, in Python, you're going to be dealing with a lot of data. And so a lot of times in our program, we're going to be working with all types of information and data and values. And sometimes that data can be difficult to manage. So in Python, we have this thing called a variable, and it's basically just a container where we can store certain data values. And when we use a variable, when we put those data values inside containers, it makes it a lot easier for us to work with and manage all of the different data inside of our programs. So variables are extremely helpful, and it's sort of like a core topic in Python that you're really going to want to know and master. So in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you guys everything you need to know to get started with variables. We're going to look at what they are, why they're useful, and we'll look at the different types of variables and the different types of data that we can store inside of variables. So over here in my Python file, I just have a very simple program, and it's basically just printing some text out onto the screen. And so this is actually a little story that I wrote. It says, "There once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. So this is a valid Python program. I could go ahead and run this program, and you'll see down here in the console, everything prints out and it looks great. So we have an awesome little Python program here. But let's say that inside of our story, I wanted to change the character's name. So instead of naming the character George, let's say I wanted to name the character John. Well, I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to manually change the name George to the name John at every place inside of this story where it's mentioned. So I'm going to have to go over here and I'll say, okay, John, I'm going to have to manually change that. And then, okay, down here, we're going to have to, again, manually type in John and change it to John. So in order to change the character's name, I had to manually go in and change it in both places. And now let's say, okay, maybe we want to change the character's age also. So in addition to changing the name, we also want to change the age. Let's make him a little bit younger. So why don't we say John is going to be 35. And so you'll see here I had to come here and manually change the age, and then come down here and manually change it again, right? And now that we changed it, like, it's going to work, it's going to be updated in our program. But you'll notice that in order to make that change, like, I had to look through the entire program, find where that value was, and change it. And this was only with 4 lines of the story. Imagine if I had a story that was like thousands of lines long, and we mentioned the character's name and age like hundreds of times. I mean, I'd have to look through each one of those lines and manually change the character's name. And that is not a very good way for us to do this. And it's really not a good way for us to manage the data in our program, right? The character's name and the age. And so we can actually use a variable in order to store the character's name and the character's age. And when we use that variable, it'll make it a lot easier for us to put the character's name and age inside of our little program here. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create a variable for the character's name and age. And I'm just going to go up here above this print statement. And up here, I want to create a variable. So when we create a variable in Python, we actually need to give Python a couple pieces of information. The first piece of information we need to give Python is the name of the variable. So I need to actually assign a name to this container where we're going to be storing information. And so all I have to do is just type out the name of the variable that I want to create. So I'm going to create a variable called character name. So I'm just going to say character, and I'm going to say underscore name. And so generally when you're creating a name for a variable in Python, you want to separate different words with an underscore. So I have 2 words here and I'm separating them with an underscore. And now what I need to do is I need to put a value inside of this variable. So basically what I can do is I can just say equals, and over here I can type a value. So I'm just going to type out the character's name inside of quotation marks. So we're just going to type out John. So now we have a variable for the character's name. And below this character name variable, I want to create another variable called character age. So I'm just going to type out character underscore age, and I'm going to set this equal to the character's age, which is 35. So we now have two variables, one representing the character's name and one representing the character's age. So what I can do now is I can replace the character's name inside of the story with this variable. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So if we want to put a variable inside of this print statement, I'm actually going to have to do a couple things. The first thing I'm going to have to do is end off this text in here. So I'm going to have to put a quotation marks here at the end. And you can see I'm basically wrapping this whole thing into a single like quoted line. And now I also have this text over here at the end, so I'm going to have to put a quotation mark here. So now I have a bunch of text here in quotation marks, and then I also have text over here in quotation marks. Now inside of here, instead of saying the character's name, I want to refer to that character name variable. So I'm just going to say plus character underscore name, and I want to say another plus sign. So I basically am saying I want to print out all of this text plus the value that's stored inside of character name plus all of this text. And what this will do is it'll actually print out the character's name when we print this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this program, and you'll see down here, and actually let me put a space over here and we'll run it again. So you can see down here we still are printing out there once was a man named John. And so what Python is doing is when it executes this line of code, it's coming over here and it's seeing, oh, okay, they want to print out the value inside of character name. So Python's going to go up here, it's going to get the value, and it's going to insert it inside of there. So I can basically do this for every instance of the character name in my file. So I can, I'll just copy this guy right here, and I can just paste it down here where the character's name is. So I'll paste this, and you can see now we're doing exactly the same thing that we did up there. I can also do this for the character's age. So I'm going to come down here and I'll paste in what we just pasted in, and I'm going to change this. Instead of character name, we'll change it to character age. And I'm going to do this in one more spot. So we're going to do this over here where we're mentioning the age. And again, I'll just change this to character age. And so now when I run this program, it's going to print out the same story that we were printing out before, but now I don't actually have to type in the character's name and the character's age. I can just refer to this variable. And the cool thing about variables is if I wanted to change the character's name, now all I have to do is change it up here. So I could change the character's name to like Tom or something, and we could also change their age. So I could change the age to be like 50. And now that's going to automatically update throughout our entire story. So when I click this play button, you'll see now we're using the name Tom, and he's 50 years old. So that's where variables can come in handy, and this can be a really awesome way to control and manage the data that's inside of our programs. With variables, you can also modify their values. So for example, let's say that halfway through the story I wanted to change the character's name. Well, I can just make some new lines over here, and down here I can actually assign a new value to one of these variables. So I could say like character underscore name, and in order to give it a different value, all I have to do is just say equals, and we'll give it a different value. So let's say halfway through the story we want to change the character's name to Mike. Well, now when I run my program, you'll see here in the first part of the story it says there once was a man named Tom, and in the second part of the story it's referring to the name as Mike. So I actually updated the variable inside of my program over here. And that's a really awesome way. A lot of times in these programs you're going to want to be modifying the values of variables, and so you can do it just like that. And so finally, I want to talk to you guys about the different types of data that we can store inside of these variables. So over here I have the character name and the character age, and I'm actually storing what are called strings. So a string is basically just plain text, right? So the name Tom, that's just plain text. Down here, these guys are strings as well. So there's a data type in Python called a string, and it's just basically going to store plain text. So, any text that you would have like in a story or, someone's name, you can store inside of a string. There's also another type of data that we can store inside of Python, which is numbers. So in addition to storing text, we can also store numbers. So if I wanted to store a number, for example, let's say we wanted to store the character age instead of inside of a string, we could store it inside of a number. So I could just type out 50. And when we're storing a number, we don't need these quotation marks. You only need that quotation mark when you're storing a string. So if I wanted to store a number, I can just write it out like this. And in addition to using whole numbers, I could also use decimal numbers. So I could say like 50.5678213. And Python's gonna be able to store that number as well. So you can store all different types of numbers. And we can also store what's called a Boolean value. And a Boolean value is essentially a true or a false value. And there's a lot of instances in programming where we're gonna wanna represent true or false data. For example, I could have a variable called like is male. And this would tell me whether or not someone was a male. And in my case, it would be true because I'm a guy, right? So I can, actually this needs to be capital. So I could store a value of either true or false. And actually, if we were naming this in Python, we'd want to use an underscore. So I would say is underscore male, and this can be either true or false. So true or false values is maybe not something that you're used to dealing with like in the real world, but in programming, we're going to be using true or false values all the time. They're super important. So like I said, there's three basic types of data that we can work with in Python. There's strings, which is just like plain text. Numbers, which would be like either decimal numbers or whole numbers like this. And there's true or false values. And these are the basic types of data. I mean, there's a bunch of other types of data that we can use, but I would say 99% of the time as a new user and a new programmer to Python, you're just going to be dealing with these three types of data. So those are the basics of the data, and also with variables, and you're going to be using variables all the time in Python, so you definitely want to practice up and get comfortable using them. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with strings in Python. Now, one of the most common types of data that we're going to be working with in Python is going to be strings. And strings are basically just plain text. So any text that we want to have inside of our program, we can store inside of a string. So I want to talk to you guys about all the cool things we can do with strings, and we're basically just going to get a full introduction into why strings are awesome. So over here, I'm just going to actually print out a string. So I'm just going to say print, and inside of these parentheses, I can type out a string. In order to create a string, I need to use quotation marks. So I can make an open and close quotation marks just like that. Now inside of the quotation mark, I can put whatever text I want the string to have. So we could say like Draft Academy. And so now we have a string with the text Draft Academy inside of it. So if I run my program, now down here, we're gonna print out Draft Academy, as you can see. And when we have these strings, there's actually a bunch of cool things that we can do with them. So one thing I could do would be to create a new line inside of the string. So if I wanted, I could come over here and I could say \n, and you can see it got highlighted in a different color. And what this is gonna do is it's actually gonna insert a new line into the string. So now it's gonna say draft on one line and academy on another line. So I'm gonna click play, and you'll see down here we just get Draft Academy. In addition to the \n, I could also use a / quotation mark. So if I wanted to put a quotation mark inside of my string, I can't just put a quotation mark like that, because Python's gonna think that I'm trying to end this string. So if I want to include a quotation mark, I can just use this special / character, and that's called the escape character, and it basically just tells Python that whatever character comes after it, we want to render literally. So when I say / quotation mark, it basically means like, hey Python, I want to print out a quotation mark. And so now we'll be able to print out a quotation mark right there. I can also use this to print out a \. So if I needed to print out a \, I could say \, and it'll just print out a normal \. now. So you can see just like that. So if you want, you can use that \ to make new lines or print out quotation marks, or you can just use it as a normal \. In addition to just typing out a string here, I could also create a string variable. So I could come down up here and we can create a variable, and we'll just call it phrase. and I'm going to set it equal to Draft Academy. So I can store this string value inside of a variable called phrase, and then when I want to print out that variable, or I want to access that string variable, I can just type the name of the variable, and you'll see that it's going to print out the value that was stored inside of it. I can also use something called concatenation. And concatenation is basically the process of taking a string and appending another string onto it. So I could come over here and I could say phrase, and I could say plus, and now I can add in another string. So I could say like is cool. And now this is gonna say Draft Academy is cool. So I'm basically appending another string onto another one. They call that concatenation. And so in addition to doing all that stuff, we can also use special things called functions. And a function is basically just a little block of code that we can run, and it'll perform a specific operation for us. And so we can use functions to modify our strings, and we can also use functions to get information about our strings. So I'm going to show you guys a couple common functions we can use with these strings, and they're actually going to do awesome stuff. So in order to access one of these functions, I can just say phrase, and then I can say dot. And I'm going to show you guys a function that we can use to convert this string entirely into lowercase. So I could just say phrase.lower, and then I'm going to want to type in open and close parentheses. And this will take this phrase, it'll take my string, and it'll convert it to lowercase. So you can see now we just have Draft Academy down here, but it's entirely in lowercase. I could also do the same thing for uppercase. So I could say phrase.upper, and this will convert the entire string into uppercase. So you can see now it's entirely uppercase. So in addition to converting the string into uppercase and lowercase, I could also check to see if a string is entirely uppercase or entirely lowercase. So for example, I could say phrase.isUpper, and this is going to give me back a true or a false value. So it's going to be true if the string is entirely uppercase, or false if it's not. And you can see here we're getting a false value because this isn't uppercase. I can also use these functions in combination with each other. So for example, I could say phrase.upper, and then a parentheses, and then after this I could say .isUpper. And now what it's going to do is it's going to run this upper function, it's going to convert it into uppercase, and then it's going to run this isUpper function right after that, and you'll see now we're going to get a true value back because it will have converted the whole thing into uppercase. So you can see now we're getting a true value. So you can use these functions one after another. It can be really useful. And there's a few other ones that I want to show you. So we can also figure out the length of this string. So if I wanted to figure out how many characters were inside of this string, I could just say len, and I'm actually going to make an open parentheses, and I'm going to make a close parentheses. So I'm essentially saying len, and this is another function, it's the length function. And inside of this len function, I'm actually passing this phrase variable. I'm basically giving the length function this, and it's going to spit out a number. So it'll tell me how many characters are inside of this string. And so you can see here we get 15 because there's 15 characters inside of Draft Academy. So that's how we can get the length of a string, and that's going to be really useful as we go forward in Python. We can also get individual characters inside of a string. So imagine if I wanted to just grab one of these characters. Like imagine if I wanted to figure out what the first character in this string is. Well, I can actually use an open and closed square bracket just like that. And in here, I can specify the index of the character that I want to grab. So if I wanted to grab the first character in this string, I can put in a 0. So if I say phrase square bracket 0, this is going to give me that capital G. And you can see down here, that's what gets printed out. Now I want to point something out. In Python, when we're working with strings, a string gets indexed starting with 0. So you'll notice that in order to access this G, I had to put a 0 in here. And that's because in Python, when we use indexes on a string, we start with 0. So if Python is counting the characters, or it's indexing the characters in a string, it's going to start with 0. So it's going to say G is 0, I is 1, R is 2, A is 3. So we would say that G is at position 0 in the string, I is at position 1, R is at position 2, A is at position 3, etc. So we start counting at 0. So if I wanted to access the first character in the string, this G, I have to say phrase 0. And that's just a special thing in Python. And actually, most programming languages do that. So they'll start with 0. So for example, if I wanted to access this A, I'm going to have to put 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I put 3 inside of here, now we'll be able to access that first A. As you can see, we get an A right here. So this is actually really useful, being able to grab a specific character inside of a string, and you're going to be using that a lot as we go forward in Python. There's also another really awesome function that we can use, and it's called the index function. And basically what the index function will do is it'll tell us where a specific character or string is located inside of our string. So I could say phrase.index, and I can actually give this a value. So sometimes when we use these functions in Python, we can actually give them information. So I can give this a value. And we would call this passing a parameter. So I would call a value that I would give to a function a parameter. And you'll hear that word a lot. So for example, I could say inside of here, capital G, and now this is going to return the index of the capital G inside of our string. So it should give us back a 0 because G is at the 0th index. And you'll see down here that we get a 0 because that's where G is. So for example, if I put an A inside of here, like a lowercase a, it should give me 0, 1, 2, 3, because that's where the first A is inside of this string. So I can click the play button, and you'll see it's giving us a 3. You can also put actual words in here. So for example, I could put like academy in here, or I could even just put like ACAD, and this is gonna tell me where this starts inside of my string. So when I click play, it's gonna give me an 8 because that's where academy starts, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I put something in here that wasn't in the string, so for example, if I put a Z in here, that's not in here, it's actually gonna throw an error. So when I play this, you'll see that we get this error down here because Z is not found inside of our program. So that index function, again, can be really useful, and we'll be using that a lot. There's also one more that I wanna show you, which is called replace. So we can say phrase.replace, and in here, I can actually give this 2 parameters. So I can give this replace function 2 values that it can use. And the first thing I want to give it is what I want to replace. So for example, I could say giraffe, and then I'm gonna put a comma in here, and I wanna put in here what I wanna replace giraffe with. So I could just say like elephant, and now instead of saying Giraffe Academy, this is gonna print out Elephant Academy. So you can see down here, it just says Elephant Academy. So this replace function can be really awesome because we can replace certain words or even certain letters inside of our strings with other ones. So those are just some basic ways that we can work with strings inside of Python. And there's a lot of these different functions that we can use with strings. These are some of the most common, the ones that I just showed you right now. But if you just do a Google search, you can find all sorts of Python functions that you can try out and use and see what they do. But you definitely want to get comfortable working with strings in Python because you're going to be working with them a lot. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about working with numbers in Python. Now, numbers are one of the most common data types in Python, and any Python program you write is most likely going to be dealing with numbers at some point. So I want to talk to you guys about just the basics of using numbers. We're going to talk about the different types of numbers that we can represent in Python. And I also want to show you guys some awesome functions that we can use with numbers. So we can do certain like mathematical operations. We can do some awesome things with numbers. I'm going to show you guys all of that in this video. It's going to be awesome. So first thing we can do is we can actually just like print out a number. So if I want to write a number in Python, it's really easy. I basically just write the number. So I could say like print 2, and this is just going to print the number 2 out onto the screen. So I can use a whole number like this. I could also use a decimal number. So I could say like 2.0987. And Python's gonna be just fine with that. We'll be able to print that out onto the screen as well. I can also make numbers negative. So I could make this 2.0987 a negative number, and Python will be able to handle that just fine too. In Python, we can also use basic arithmetic. So I could do things like addition, subtraction, multiplication. So I could say like 3 plus 4. And now this is going to print this out. Or why don't we say like 3 plus 4.5. And this will be able to print out the answer. So we get 7.5. And we can do addition, we could do subtraction, we could do division, or we could do like multiplication as well. So you can pretty much do whatever you want inside of Python. And if you want to make more complex mathematical equations, we can also use things to specify order of operations. So I could use parentheses. So for example, if I said 3 times 4 plus 5, what Python's going to do is it's going to multiply 3 and 4 together. So it's going to be 12, and then we'll add 5 to that. So we should get 17. But let's say that we wanted to change up the order, right? I could actually put a parentheses around 4 and 5. And now it's going to add them first. So it'll add 4 and 5. So we'll get 9, and we'll multiply that times 3. So we should end up with 27. So you can see we can use those parentheses to specify order of operations. So I could make like a very complex little equation here just by using numbers and parentheses. We can also use one other operation, which is called the modulus operator. So I could say like 10 and use this percent sign 3. And this is actually read 10 mod 3. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to take the first number, divide it by the second number, and it's going to spit out the remainder. So it's basically going to say, okay, 10 divided by 3, that's going to be 3 with a remainder of 1. And so this is going to give us the remainder. And you'll see down here we get 1 because that's the remainder of 10 divided by 3. And that modulus operator can come in handy quite a bit. We can also store these numbers inside of variables. So we can store them inside of these variable containers. So I could come over here and I could create a variable called like my_num, and we'll just store a value of, let's say like 5 in here. And so I could come down here and I can just print out my_num, and we'll be able to print that number out to the screen just fine. So in addition to doing things like a basic arithmetic, we can also do some other stuff. So one thing I could do is I could actually convert this number into a string. So if I wanted to convert this number into a string, I can just say str, and I can put the number that I want to convert inside of these parentheses. And so what's going to happen now is this number is going to be converted into a string. So when I click the run button, you'll see it's just printing out 5, but now instead of being a number, this is actually a string. And this is going to come in handy when you want to print out numbers alongside strings. So I can come over here and I can say like my favorite number, and we'll be able to print this number along with this string. So I can click play and it says 5, my favorite number. If I was to get rid of this string right here and I wasn't converting the number into a string, now Python's going to have a problem with this. It's not going to allow us to do that. You can see we get an error. So anytime you want to print out a number next to a string, you got to make sure that you use that little string function. So there's a bunch of other stuff that we can do with numbers, and a lot of times in Python, you're going to want to be using specific, like more advanced math operators. So there's a bunch of different math functions that we can use on our numbers. And a function is basically just like a little collection of code that does something. So a function could perform an operation like a mathematical operation on our number. It could also give us information about our number. So I'm going to show you guys some of the most common functions that you'll be using in Python related to numbers. The first one is called ABS, and it stands for absolute value. So we can get the absolute value of a number. And so over here, I'm just going to make this variable -5. And basically, I can just say ABS, and I can make an open and close parentheses over here. And this is going to give me the absolute value of this number up here. So when I click the play button, you'll see it's just giving us 5, because 5 is the absolute value of -5. I can use a few other functions. There's another one which is called POW. It's just POW. And I'm actually not going to use this variable. We just use a normal number. And this function is going to allow us to pass it 2 pieces of information. So I can give this function 2 pieces of information. The first is going to be like a number, and the second is going to be the power that I want to take that number to. So I could say like 3, 2, and this is basically just going to be 3 raised to the power of 2. So it's just going to be 3 squared. So we should get 9 down here. You can see that we do. So I could pass in like, you know, some crazy number, like we could pass in a 4 and we could raise it to the power of 6. And so we should get like a pretty big number here. And you can see we get 4,096. So this pow function is really useful for taking numbers to specific powers. So in addition to using this pow function, we can also use another function which is called max. So I can say max, and what this is going to do is it's basically going to return the larger of the 2 numbers that we pass into it. So right now I'm giving this a 4 and a 6, and this should tell us which number is higher. So over here it's just printing out 6 because that's the bigger number. I can also use another function called min, and this is going to do the opposite. So now instead of printing out the max number, it's going to print out the smallest number, and it's going to print out 4 down here, as you can see. Another cool function is called the round function, and this is going to allow us to round a number. So it's just going to follow like standard rounding rules. So if I said like 3.2 inside of here, now it's going to round it down to just normal 3. But if I said like 3.7, it's going to round it up to 4. So that'll allow you to round a number. So there's a few other functions that I want to show you guys, but in order to get access to them, I'm actually going to have to do something called importing. And in Python, we can actually import external code into our files. And so if I want to access these specific math functions, I have to import something called Python math. So I can just say from up here, math, import, and this star. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to go out and it's going to grab a bunch of different math functions that we can use. So I already showed you guys a few of these different math functions, but there's actually a bunch more. And in order to access them, we're going to need to include this line of code inside of our file. So once we have that, now I can access a few others. So there's another function which is called the floor method, and it's just floor. And what this will do is it'll basically just grab the lowest number. So it's essentially just going to chop off this decimal point. And you can see over here now we get a 3 because we're using that floor function. There's also another one called ceil, and that's just going to do the exact opposite. So that's just going to round the number up no matter what. So no matter what, we'll always get 4 if we have a 3 point whatever here. And there's another one which is called square root. So it's just sqrt. And essentially this is just going to return the square root of a number. So I could say like 36, and now we should get 6 back. So those are all some very interesting functions. And inside of this math module, so we would call this a module, and you don't have to worry too much about what that is right now. Just know that when we put this line of code into our program, it gives us access to a lot more math functions. So it basically allows us to do a lot more things with math inside of our program. And there's a bunch of different math functions in Python. And if you want, you can basically just go online and search for different math functions. I showed you guys a few here, and I would say the ones that we looked at here are probably the most commonly used, but there's a bunch more. And like I said, there's tons of documentation on all of this stuff. So you can just look up, math functions in Python, and there's going to be tons and tons, like lists of these things that you can use inside of your programs to perform different math operations. But for now, that's just been a little bit about using numbers, a little bit about doing, certain math operations and using functions with those numbers. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get input from a user. So we're basically going to allow a user to input information into our program. And I'm actually going to take the information that the user inputs, I'm going to store it inside of a variable, and then we're going to be able to do something with that variable. So I want to show you guys how we can actually go about getting input from someone. And down here in my Python file, all I have to do to get input from someone is I just have to type out input and then an open and closed parentheses. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to tell Python like, hey, we want to get input from a user, and Python will allow the user to type in some information. And inside of these parentheses, we can actually type a prompt. And so generally when we want the user to enter in some information, we want to tell them what we want them to enter. And that's what we can put inside of here. So I'm just going to say, enter your name. So we're actually going to create a little Python app which is going to allow the user to enter in their name, and then we'll store the name inside of a variable, and then we'll basically just say hi to the user. So we'll say like hi, and then whatever the name they entered was. So what I want to do is I actually want to store whatever the user inputted into our program inside of a variable. So I can actually go over here and I can create a variable. I could just call it name, and I could set this variable equal to input. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the value that the user inputs and I'm storing it inside of this variable container called name. And so now I have access to whatever they entered in. So what we can do is we can say print, and inside of the parentheses I can just print out hello, and then I'm just going to add on to this name. And actually, why don't we put an exclamation point? So essentially we're getting a name from the user, we're storing it inside of the name variable, and I'm printing it out onto the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and when we run the program, you'll notice down here Python is giving us this little prompt. So it's saying enter your name. And now in here I can actually type in a value. So I could type in Mike, and then I can just hit enter, and Python's going to go ahead, store this value inside of that variable, and then it's going to print out hello Mike. And so this is kind of cool, and actually what we could do is we could prompt the user to enter in more than one piece of information. So I could actually copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it below here, and why don't we have the user enter in another variable. So we could have them enter in, for example, their age. And over here we just want to say enter your age. And so now we're able to get two pieces of information from the user, and I could say hello name, and then I can say you are, and I'll print out their age. So I'm just going to print age. So now I'm basically able to get both of these pieces of information from the user. I can get their name and I can get their age. So when we run this program, I can type in both of those pieces of information. So it'll say enter your name. So we could just make up a name like John, and then enter the age. Let's say John is 25. And now it's going to say, hello John, you are 25. So the program is able to get input from the user, and then it's able to use that information in order to say hi to the user and tell them how old they are. And so getting input from the user is a great way to make your programs more interactive. And here we're just scratching the surface, right? We're just basically getting two, pieces of information from the user, but you can use these inputs to do awesome things in Python. And as we go through this course, you're going to see some really cool things that we can do with these inputs. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a very basic calculator in Python. We're basically going to build a calculator where we'll get two numbers from a user, and then we'll add those numbers together and print the answer out onto the screen. So this will give us some practice in getting input from users, and we'll also talk about getting numbers from users as opposed to just strings. So I'm really excited to get started on this calculator. The first thing we want to do is create two variables, and inside of those variables we want to store the two numbers that the user wants to add together. So down here I'm just going to say num1, and that's what we'll call our first variable, is equal to, and now I need to get input from the user. So I'm going to say input, and inside these parentheses I'm going to say enter a number. And now I basically want to do the same exact thing, but for the second number. So we'll paste this guy down here, and I'm just going to say num2, and then we'll just say enter another number. So now we're able to store the user's input inside of these two variables. So now all I want to do is just print out the result. So I'm actually going to create a variable called result. So I'm just going to say result is equal to, and basically we just want to add these two numbers together. So I'm going to say num1 plus num2. And now all we have to do is just print out the result. So I'm just going to print result. So we basically have our entire program written out here, and this will allow us to enter in two numbers, and then we'll add them together and print out the answer. So I'm going to click play, and down here we can enter our number. So I'm going to enter the first number, we'll say 5. and I'm going to enter my second number. So let's say 8.0, or let's say 8.3. So now it should print out the answer. But if you look over here, that's not quite the answer we were looking for, right? 5 plus 8.3 is definitely not 58.3. And here's what happened. When we get input from a user, by default, Python is just going to convert it into a string. So it doesn't matter what we put down there when we're entering the numbers. Python's always just going to be like, okay, this is a string, that's it, sounds good, right? It's just going to make it a string. In order for us to make these num1 and num2 variables numbers, we're actually going to have to convert the strings that we get from the user into numbers. And so the way that we can do that is by basically just coming over here, and when we add the two numbers together, I can use a special Python function in order to convert those strings into numbers. And there's actually two Python functions that we could use for this. The first is called int. So I could say int, I can make an open parentheses, and I can make a close parentheses. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to convert whatever is inside of these open and closed parentheses into an integer number. And an integer number is basically a whole number. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a whole number. In other words, it can't have a decimal point. And so what I could do is I could say int, and I could put these inside of parentheses. And now what this is going to do is it's going to convert both of these numbers into integers. In other words, into whole numbers that don't have decimals. And it's going to add them together and we'll print out the result. So why don't we do that and we'll just see if this works. So I'm going to click the play button, and down here we'll enter our first number. So I'm just going to enter in a 4, and then I'll enter in a 5. And now you can see it's printing out the correct answer, 4 plus 5. And so that's essentially our basic calculator. But we do have one problem with this calculator. So I'm going to run it again and I'll show you guys what that problem is. If I wanted to add in a decimal number, so we'll add 4.3 and 5.5, you'll see that we're getting this error. And that's because I'm using this int function up here. And this int function is looking for a whole number. So if I put decimal numbers inside of there, it's going to break the program. There's another function we can use. Instead of an int, we can say float. And a float is basically just a number that has decimals. So it's a decimal number. And so I can convert both of these guys into floats. And now I'll be able to use decimal numbers. So I can click play, and I can just enter in some numbers. So I could say like 4, and I could also say like 5.5. And now it's going to be able to add both of those numbers, even if one of them is a decimal. And that's the beauty of using that little float function. So in certain circumstances, you might want the user to only be able to enter in an integer, so a whole number. But in a lot of cases, like in this calculator, we want them to be able to enter any number that they want. So we're going to use this float function. So I'm just going to recap what we did one more time. We created two variables, num1 and num2. And we basically stored the two numbers that the users inputted into those variables. And then we converted them into numbers, and we added them together and we printed out the results. So this is a pretty cool calculator. I'm happy with it. Hopefully you guys learned something. And as we go forward in this Python course, you're going to learn all sorts of ways that we can make this calculator more complex. In this tutorial, I want to show you guys how to build a Mad Libs game in Python. So a Mad Libs game is basically just a game where you can enter in a bunch of random words, so like, verbs, nouns, names, colors, and you basically take all of those words and put them into a story randomly. So over here, my web browser, I just have an example of a Mad Libs. So, down here, we're basically just taking random words like an adjective or a noun or a plural noun and entering them inside of a story. So like you read through the story and then like some random word pops up. And Mad Libs can be pretty fun. And I'm sure you guys have, at least heard of Mad Libs before. But if not, that was just a little introduction. So I want to create a Mad Libs in Python, and this is going to be really cool. So down here I have this like little poem. It just says, "Roses are red, violets are blue, I love you." And so, this is kind of like a classic poem, but I think we should mix it up a little bit and create a Mad Lib for this poem. And so instead of having this red color over here, I want to have the user enter in their own color. Instead of having violets, why don't we have them enter in a plural noun? And instead of saying I love you, why don't we have them say I love and then some celebrity, so celebrity. So this is the basic structure for our little Mad Lib, right? I want to basically have the user enter in a color, enter in a plural noun, and enter in a celebrity. And then I'll take all of those words and put them inside of our Mad Lib, and hopefully we end up with something that's pretty funny. So how can we actually go about building this in Python? Well, the first thing we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to be able to get these words from the user, right? That's pretty obvious. So I think what we should do is we should create 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity, and we'll store the user's inputs inside of those variables. So up here, let's create those variables. The first variable I want to create is going to be called color. So we'll say color, and I want to set this equal to the input. So I'm going to say input, and inside of here, I'm just going to give them a prompt. So I'll say enter a color, and we can basically just copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it down below, and we'll paste one more time. So now we're going to create our plural noun variable. So I'll say plurao, plural noun. And we'll just say enter a plural noun. And actually over here I want to make a colon as well. So then finally we'll create our celebrity variable, and we'll say enter a celebrity. And so now basically we're creating 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity. And inside of them we're storing the color that the user enters, the plural noun the user enters, and the celebrity the user enters. So the last thing we have to do is replace these guys with those variables. So I'm basically just going to add in the color over here, and we're gonna add in the plural noun. So I can just go like this. And finally, we'll just add in that celebrity. So now we have a pretty cool Mad Lib, and it should be functional. Everything should work. It looks like it's good to go. So let's come over here and we'll run our program, and then down here in the console, we can play our little Mad Libs game. So let's say enter a color. I'm just gonna say magenta. Enter a plural noun. Why don't we say microwaves? And enter a celebrity. Let's say Tom Hanks. So when I click enter, what should happen is we should get our Mad Libs printed out. So I'm gonna click enter, and now we have our Mad Lib. So it says roses are magenta, microwaves are blue, I love Tom Hanks. So it's a pretty good Mad Lib, and obviously, you know, the more print statements we put over here, you know, the better the Mad Lib could be, and we could store as many, you know, variables up here as we wanted. This was just a very simple Mad Lib. We only took in 3 inputs, but you know, you could see how you could take something like this and create a little Mad Libs game. So your homework for this lesson is to go off and make your own Mad Libs game, hopefully one that's a little bit funnier than mine. But that's the basics of creating a Mad Libs game in Python. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with lists in Python. A lot of times when you're programming in Python, you're going to be dealing with large amounts of data. And when you're dealing with large amounts of data, you want to make sure that you can manage it and organize it properly. And a list is essentially just a structure that we can use inside of Python to store lists of information. So we can take a bunch of different data values, we can put them inside a list, and it allows us to organize them and keep track of them a lot easier. So generally you would create a Python list and you would put a bunch of related values inside of that list, and then you can use it throughout your program. So I'm going to show you guys just the basics of using lists. We're going to look at some of the common use cases and really just get you up to speed with what lists are and why they're useful. So over here in my program, I'm actually going to create a list, and we create a list a lot like we create a Python, just like a normal Python variable. So the first thing we want to do when we're making a list is give it a name. So we want to give it a descriptive name, something that's going to basically describe what's inside the list. In my case, for this example, let's make a list of like friends. So we could say like, here's a list of all my friends. So I can say friends, And I'm going to set this equal to the list of values that represent my friends. And when we want to create a list, we can use these open and closed square brackets. So whenever you use these open and closed square brackets, Python basically knows, okay, they want to store a bunch of values inside of this list. So why don't we go ahead and start adding some values? So we can say like my friends are like Kevin, Karen, and let's say Jim. So here I have 3 values inside of my friends array. So when we're creating a normal variable in Python, generally we just give it one value, right? So I would create a variable, I would give it one value, maybe a string or a number or a Boolean. But when we make lists, we're able to store multiple values inside of the same like little item, inside of the same object, right? And then what I can do is I can access these individual items inside of my program. So inside of this friends list, we're basically storing all of these different values, and that can be really useful. So now that we've stored some values, let's talk about what you can put inside of a list. So you can really put any piece of information in Python. We could put things like strings, numbers, or Booleans. So if I wanted, instead of just putting strings here, I could change like one of these to a number, and I could change one of these to a Boolean, and it wouldn't matter. Python's going to be fine with that. But let's change these back to strings just for the sake of the example. So now that we've created our list, how can we access individual elements inside of this list? It's a good question. I'm going to go ahead and print something out to the screen. The first thing we can do is we can just print out the actual list. So I can just say print friends, and then when I run this program, if we look down here in the console, you can see it's just printing out the actual list of friends, right? But let's say that I wanted to print out a specific element inside of this list. Well, I can actually refer to elements by their index. So each one of the elements inside of this list has a particular index. And the indexes actually start at 0. So we would say that this first element in the list, Kevin, has an index of 0. We would say that this other element, Karen, has an index of 1, and this third element, Jim, would have an index of 2. So even though Jim is technically the third element inside of the list, it has an index of 2. And that's because we start indexing at index position 1. And so that's just kind of how lists work, and that's how list indexes work. So if I wanted to access a specific element inside of my friends list, I can just refer to it by its index. So over here, after we type out friends, I'm just going to type an open and closed square bracket. And inside of this open and closed square bracket, I want to put the index of the element inside the list that I want to access. So if I wanted to access this guy right here, this element, I can just put a 0. So I can say friends 0, and now when I run my program, it's just going to print out that value. It's just going to print out Kevin. If I wanted to access this Jim value over here, I can put a 2. And that will give us that Jim value. You can see right there. So we can access elements based off of their index. We can also access elements based off of their index from the back of the list. So for example, if I said -1 inside of here, this is going to give me access to this value right here for Jim. And you can see that's what it does. So when we use negatives, it starts indexing from the back of the list. So if I said -2, this is going to give us Karen. And so you can use the negatives to access items at the back of the list. Just keep in mind though, and this is kind of interesting, we would say this first element here is index position 0, right? But we would say the first element at the back of the list is index position -1. So just keep that in mind. So there's actually other ways that we can access like just portions of this list. So for example, let's say I just wanted to select the last 2 elements in this list and I didn't want to select the first one. Well, in here, I can just say 1 with a colon, and this will grab the element at index position 1 and all of the elements after that. So now we should just grab Jim and Karen, or Karen and Jim in that order. I could also specify a range. So actually, let me add in a couple other elements just so that we can illustrate this better. So I'll add in 2 more names. So if I wanted to, I could select like the element at index position 1 up to the element at index position 3. So it's going to grab this one, so that's 1, 2, and it's actually not going to grab the third one. So it's going to grab all the elements up to, but not including 3. So it'll grab Karen and Jim. So let's go ahead and run this, and you can see it grabs Karen and Jim. So you can either just put like 1 with a colon after it, and then it'll grab that index position and everything after it, or you can specify like a range that you want to grab from. So that's how we can access elements inside of this list, but we can also modify elements. So for example, I could come down here. Let's say I want to modify this value right here, Karen. Well, all I have to do is just access that element. So I could say friends, and Karen is at index position 1. And I could change this to whatever I want. So I could say friends index position 1 is equal to Mike. And now when we print out friends index position 1, that value is going to be updated. So it's just going to say Mike instead of saying Karen. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of arrays. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of Python lists. So those are kind of the basics of working with lists in Python. And actually in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys even more ways that we can use these lists. We're going to learn how to like add elements to a list, delete elements from a list, copy lists, and a bunch of cool stuff with these lists. But for now, this has just been sort of like the basics of working with lists. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using functions with lists in Python. In Python, a list is one of the most important structures where we can store our information. A list basically allows you to take a bunch of different values and organize them and store them inside of their own little list structure. So down here in my program, you can see I have 2 lists. I have a list of lucky numbers, and this is just a bunch of different numbers. And then I have a list of friends. So this could be like a list of somebody's friends, and it's basically just a bunch of strings with names in them. So these 2 lists are storing a bunch of different values. And what makes lists awesome is not only could I store like this many values, I mean, I could store hundreds or thousands or millions of values. And when you're working with a lot of data and a lot of information in Python, these lists are invaluable. So because lists are so important, there's actually a bunch of different functions that we can use with lists. And those functions allow us to do things like modify the lists and get information about the lists. So in this tutorial, I just want to show you a bunch of those functions. We're going to talk about some of the most common and the most popular functions that you would use on lists to make them more powerful and make them more easy to use. So the first thing we can do is obviously just print out a list. So down here, I'm printing out this friends list. And when I run my program, you see down here, we're just printing out all the elements in the list. So it's always good to be able to print out all the elements inside of a list. But there's a lot of other functions that we can use. So one function is called the extend function. And the extend function will basically allow you to take a list and append another list onto the end of it. So I could say like friends.extend, and inside of these parentheses, I can pass in the list that I want to add on to the friends list. So I could say like lucky numbers. And now when I print out this friends list, not only is it going to have all the elements in the friends list, it's also going to have all the elements inside the lucky numbers list. You can see down here we have all of our friends, and then we also have the numbers over here. So that's a really easy way to essentially just like add 2 lists together. We can also just add individual elements onto a list. So I could come down here and I could say friends.append, and this will actually allow me to append another item onto the end of this list. So over here, I could just add another name. So we could say Creed, for example. And now I'm like adding another friend onto the end of this list. So when I run the program, in addition to having the original items that were in the list up here, we also have this additional item at the end. And that append function is always going to add the item onto the end of the list. But let's say that you wanted to add an item into the middle of the list, so like right here or right here. There's another list function called insert. And insert is going to take 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be the index where you want to insert the item. So why don't we insert it here at index position 1? I'm just going to say 1. And then I'm going to type in the name of the element that I want to add. So we can just say like Kelly. And now at index position 1, we're going to have the value Kelly. And all of these other values are going to get pushed up. They're going to get pushed to the right 1 index position. So now when I run the program, you can see we have Kevin, this new element Kelly, and then all the other elements have been pushed off to the right. We can also remove elements. So for example, let's say I wanted to remove this gym value. All I have to do is just say friends.remove, and I can just type in whatever element I want to remove. So I want to remove this gym element. And so now when we run the program, gym is going to be gone from the list, and we just have these 4 guys left. You can also remove all of the elements from the list. So if I just wanted to completely like reset the list and get rid of everything, I could just say friends.clear, and this is gonna give us an empty list. So it'll get rid of every single element inside the list. There's also another really cool method which is called pop, and you can just type out pop like that. And basically what pop's gonna do is it's gonna pop an item off of this list. So when I click the play button, you'll see here that we're left with Kevin, Karen, Jim, and Oscar. So we basically got rid of the last element inside the list, and that's what pop does. It pops an element off of the list. So it basically removes the last element in the list. So we have our list, but let's say that we wanted to figure out if a certain element was in this list, right? If a certain value is in here. So let's say I wanted to check to see if my friend Kevin was in this list. Well, I could say friends.index, and in here, I can just pass a value. So I could say like Kevin, and this is gonna tell me the index of Kevin. So it'll tell me if Kevin's in the list. So now when I click play, you can see down here it says 0. If I was to say like Oscar in here, for example, now it'll give me the index of Oscar. So that's at 3. But if I put a name that wasn't in here, so like if I put Mike, that's not in the list. And so now we're gonna get back an error because it says Mike is not in the list. So that's an easy way to figure out if a specific element is inside of the list. And if it is, then you'll know what index it's at. You can also count the number of similar elements in the list. So I'm actually going to come down here, copy this gym element, and we'll add another gym element into here. So I could come down here and I could say friends.count, and we'll pass in gym. And this will tell me how many times the value gym shows up inside of this list. So it should say 2, which it does down there because we have 2 values with the text gym. And so we have all these values. We could also sort this list. So I could come over here and I could say friends.sort. And what this will do is it'll sort the list in ascending order. So we have a bunch of text here, and you'll see what it does. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to put it in alphabetical order. So you can see we have J, K, O, and T. So the list went from being just random order, like whatever we had up here, to now it's in alphabetical order. And that's also going to work for lucky numbers. So I could say like lucky numbers dot sort, and then we'll print out lucky numbers. And these should now be in ascending order, which I'm realizing they already are up here, but if I was to take this 42 and put it down here, now it will figure everything out and put it in ascending order anyway. We can also reverse a list. So if I wanted, I could reverse this lucky numbers list. I could say lucky numbers dot reverse, and now when we print it out, instead of being 42, 8, 15, 16, 23, it's gonna be 23, 16, 15, 8, 42. So it's basically just reverse the order of the list. And finally, there's one more list function I want to show you guys, which is copy. So I could actually create another list and I could make it as a copy. So I could say like friends2, and we could set this equal to friends.copy. And now friends2 is going to have all the same attributes as friends, because it's basically just like copied. It basically took a copy of that friends list. So you can see it's the same exact thing. And copying lists can come in handy in a lot of different situations. So those are just some basic list functions, and just to kind of like, you know, get your feet wet in working with lists. Obviously, like the more you work with them, the more you practice using these different functions, the more comfortable you're going to get. But that's just kind of like a basic overview of what you can do. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about tuples in Python. Now, a tuple is a type of data structure, which basically means it's a container where we can store different values. Now, if you're familiar with lists in Python, a tuple is actually very similar to a list. It's basically a structure where we can store multiple pieces of information. But a tuple has a few key differences from lists that we're going to talk about in this tutorial. First thing I want to do is I want to show you, though, how to create a tuple. So I can come down here and I can create a tuple, and one of the most common examples of tuples is coordinates. So let's say I had a series of like XY coordinates. I could create a variable called coordinates, and I'm just going to set this equal to an open and close parentheses. And whenever we want to create a tuple inside of Python, we're going to use these open and closed parentheses. And inside of here, inside of these parentheses, we're going to put the values that we want to store. So I could, for example, put a list of numbers. So this could be like my coordinates. I could have like 4 and 5. So this would be my tuple with coordinates inside of it. And one of the things about tuples that makes them unique is a tuple is immutable. And you'll hear that word a lot when we're talking about tuples, immutable. It basically means that the tuple can't be changed or modified. Once we create our tuple up here, you cannot modify it, you cannot change it, you can't add elements to it, you can't erase elements from it, you can't change any of the elements inside the tuple. What you see is what you get. Once you create the tuple, it's as it is, it can't change. So I could come down here and I could print out some of the attributes inside the tuple, and the way I can access them is just by using an open and closed square bracket, and in here I can pass in a index. So tuples are indexed starting at 0. So technically we would say that 4 is at index position 1, and 4 is at index position 0, and 5 is at index position 1. So if I said coordinates 0, now it should print out 4. And down here we're printing out 4. So if I wanted to print out that 5, we can just put a 1 inside of those square brackets, and now we'll print out that 5. So I can access the elements inside of a tuple. I can easily access each entry, but if I was to come over here and try to change one of the elements, so if I said coordinates and coordinates 1 and I tried to set it equal to something else like 10, Python's actually going to give us an error when we run this program. So I'm going to run the program. You see we get this error. It says type error tuple object does not support item assignment because it's immutable, because we can't change it. So that's basically what tuples are, how we can create them. And you know, a tuple, like I said, it's very simple. You just create it and then you have it. And now I want to talk to you guys about a common topic in Python, which is the difference between tuples and lists. So remember, a list is basically doing the same thing. A list, if we wanted to create a list, we would just use square brackets instead of those parentheses. And if I was using a list, I could assign different values to it. I could basically mutate any of the elements. I could add, delete, modify, change, whatever I wanted with the list. But with a tuple, we can't do that. And that's sort of the basic difference. And really, Python doesn't say anything more than that. It basically just says like one of them's immutable, one of them's not. But in practical use cases, generally people will use tuples for data that's never going to change. So you'll store data inside of a tuple when that data doesn't need to be mutated. That's why something like coordinates is such a good candidate for a tuple, because once you have coordinates, like, we're probably not going to modify them, right? We might add other coordinates. So for example, if I wanted, I could create a list of tuples. So I could say like 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe we have some other coordinates like 80, 34. So here I have a list, and inside of it we have these tuples. But remember, these tuples can't be modified. The values can't be changed. So really, it's just a case-by-case basis. I would say by a huge majority, you're going to be using lists most of the time. Tuples are more of a niche. You know, they're used in more special situations. But there are plenty of situations where you want to use tuples. So if you're in a situation where you want to store data that can't be changed or mutated, then tuples are the way to go. So yeah, that's just some basics about tuples, some basics about the difference between lists and tuples. And so a tuple is a great thing to add into your Python repertoire. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using functions in Python. Now, a function is basically just a collection of code which performs a specific task. So I can take a bunch of lines of code that are basically doing one thing, I can put them inside of a function, and then when I wanted to do that task or do that one thing that the function was doing, I can just call the function. And so functions really help you to organize your code a lot better. They allow you to kind of break up your code into different, little chunks that are doing different things, and they're really just awesome. So functions are like a very core concept when we're talking about programming in Python. So I'm going to show you guys how to create an awesome function today. Let's say for the purposes of this tutorial, we want to create a function that says hi to the user. So the one task that our function performs is basically just saying hi to whoever is writing the program. So over here, if I want to write a function, the first thing I have to use is a keyword in Python. It's called def, so D-E-F. And basically when Python sees this keyword, it's going to say, oh, okay, this person wants to use a function. And so after we type out def, we need to give this function a name. So just like when we are creating variables, we give them descriptive names, we also want to do the same thing with functions. So if I'm creating a function, I can just give it a specific name which basically says like what it's doing. So we're going to create a function that says hi. So I'm just going to call this function say hi, just like that. And once we type out the name of the function, and so also I could type out say hi with no underscore, or I could type out say hi with an underscore. Both are considered like good practices in Python. A lot of times, if you just have a simple like two-word function like this, you don't need to put an underscore, but we could put an underscore there if we wanted. After we type out the name of the function, I'm just gonna type an open and close parentheses, and then I'm gonna type a colon. And basically what this is doing is it's saying to Python like, all right, all the code that comes after this line is going to be inside of our function. And in order to write code that's going to end up being inside the function, we actually have to indent it. So over here, you'll notice that when I clicked enter, my text editor automatically indented the text. So it's automatically like using this indent here. And that's kind of like one of the rules in Python is like the code that goes inside of this function needs to be indented. So if I was to write some code like out here, this is no longer going to be considered inside the function. So you can see as I type out code, and obviously this isn't real code, but as I type text over here that's indented, this little like marker over here is basically saying like, oh yeah, that's inside the function. But then when I write code over here that is like not at the same indentation level as this stuff, it's no longer considering it inside the function. So that's just a little thing. Any code inside this function needs to be indented. All right, so our function is just gonna say hi to the user. So I'm just gonna have it print out some text. It's gonna say, hello, user. So this is a very simple function. Obviously, we just have one line of code, and inside of a function, you could have as many lines of code as you want. But for our purposes, we only need one line in order to perform our function. So now all we have to do is call this function. So if I want to execute the code inside of this function, I have to do something called calling it. So if I was to just run my program as it is right now, I'm just gonna run it. You'll see that nothing happens over here, right? Even though this function is printing out hello user, when I run the program, it's not doing it. And that's because the code inside of a function isn't gonna get executed by default. The code inside of a function is only going to get executed when we specify that we want to execute it. And in order to do that, we're going to have to do something called calling the function. So in order to call the function, you basically just type out the function's name and those open and close parentheses. So I'm just going to type out say hi and open and close parentheses. And now when we run this program again, you'll see that it prints out hello user. So we're executing the code inside of the function. And I want to show you guys just one more thing here, just talking to you guys about how these functions actually work. So up here, I'm going to print top, and then down here, I'm going to print bottom. So I want to show you guys the flow of these functions inside the program. So when I run this program, you'll see we print out top, hello user, and then bottom. So essentially what's happening is when Python goes through and executes this program, it goes over here to this first line. It says, okay, we want to print out the word top. And then it goes down here and it says, okay, we want to execute the say hi function. So Python actually jumps up and it goes over to this say hi function, and it's going to execute all of the code inside of this function. So it's going to go through, execute all of this code, and then once it's done executing all of the code in the function, it's going to jump back down here and it's going to move on to the next line, which is bottom. So that's kind of like the flow of functions. Again, with functions, generally when we're naming these functions, you want them to be named in all lowercase. And usually when we're naming stuff in Python, if there's 2 or more words, we're going to use an underspace or an underscore in between them. So I could write this out as say underscore hi. But in a lot of situations though, if I have a function like this where the name is really short, it might just be easier to leave it without an underscore. But why don't we just put an underscore in there just to be super Python official. All right, so now we can actually make these functions a little bit more powerful. And what we can do is we can give them information. So a lot of times when we write a function, we're gonna want to have additional information that gets passed in. And these are called parameters. So a parameter is a piece of information that we give to the function. So over here, I can actually specify that this function needs to receive some parameters. So I can basically say like, hey, if you're gonna call this function, you need to give us some information. You need to give us some parameters. And all I have to do that is just type out the name of the parameter that I want to receive. So why don't we allow the code calling this function to tell it what name to say hi to. Up here, I can just say name. And basically what this means is, it means whenever I call this say hi function, we have to give it a name. So down here, if I was to call this, I have to include a name in here. So I can say like Mike. And what we can do now is we can actually access this parameter or this variable inside of our function. So I could come over here and instead of saying hello user, I could say hello name. And basically what this is gonna do is it's just gonna say hello to whatever name got passed in here. So I'm actually gonna copy this and we will do this twice. So I'll say hello Mike, hello Steve. And now when I run this program, you'll see that instead of just saying hello user, it's saying hello to whichever name I passed into the function. So that's why this can be really useful, right? We can give the function information, and depending on the information we give it, it'll perform its task a little bit differently. I could also include more than one parameter. So you can, I mean, technically you could have like as many parameters as you want. So I can put another one in here, we could say age, and now I'm gonna have to pass in an age along with these. So I'm just gonna pass in an age and pass in an age for down here. And I'm just gonna pass in strings. So we can say hello name, you are age. So I'm passing in two pieces of information. And now when we run this program, it's gonna call the function and it's gonna use both of those pieces of information. So I'll say, hello Mike, you are 35. Hello Steve, you are 70. So essentially we're writing out this one line of code which just prints out like hello to someone, and we're allowing this function to receive two parameters, so the name and the age. And depending on the name and the age, the function is going to print out hello a little bit differently. And that's kind of the beauty of using functions. So you could pass anything you want into a function. So for example, I could pass in a integer instead of a string for the age. So like I could pass in a number. The only difference is over here, we're going to have to convert this into a string, but it's going to work just the same. So you could pass in strings, numbers, booleans, arrays. You can really pass any type of data into a function and it's gonna work. So you can see here we get the same result. So that's the basics of functions, and as you go through with Python, you're gonna be using functions more and more. And generally, it's a good idea to break your code up into different functions. So whenever you have like a grouping of code that's designed to perform a specific task, that's usually a good candidate to be put inside of a function. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using the return statement in Python functions. Now, a Python function is basically just a collection of Python code that performs a specific task. And when we want to perform that task in our Python programs, we can call a Python function. And a lot of times when we're calling a Python function, we just kind of call it and it does its thing and then we move on with the program. But sometimes when we call a function, we're actually going to want to get information back from that function. So when I call the function, I want it to basically execute its task. I want it to execute all the code. And then I want it to give me some information back. So that could be a particular value. It could be something like telling me how the task went. Basically, the function can just communicate back to us hey, here's some information. And that's what the return keyword can allow us to do. The return keyword can basically allow Python to return information from a function. So I'm going to show you guys how we can do this. I want to create a very simple function, and it's just going to cube a number. So when we cube a number, we take it to the power of 3. So if I was going to cube 2, it'd be 2 raised to the power of 3. Right? It's just pretty basic math. So we're going to make a function that will cube a number, and I'll show you guys how we can use that return statement. So first thing we want to do is make a function. I'm just going to say def cube. We'll call the function cube. And over here we can specify any parameters that this function will take. So basically any values that we want to give this function. So we're going to give it one function, which is just going to be a number. So I'm just going to call it num. And then over here I'm going to type out a colon. And then down here we can put any of the code that we want to be included in this function. So basically this function is just going to cube this number. So we could just type out num times num times num, right? That's going to give us num cubed. So that's all well and good. And if I come down here, I can execute this function. So I can basically just call it, I'll say cube, and why don't we pass it a 3? So I'm going to go ahead and pass it a 3, and I'm going to save this. And now let's go ahead and run this code. So we'll run the code, and you'll see down here, nothing happened, right? So nothing got printed out in our program. In fact, when we called this cube function, it didn't really do anything. So let me try to print this out. So maybe if we print this function out, it'll give us back the information that we want. So type out print, and we'll print out the value of the function. I'm just going to click play. If you look down here, it says none. So when I printed out the value of this function, it told me none. But really, this function is supposed to be cubing the number. And here's how we can use the return statement in Python. I can come over here and I can just say return. And now Python is going to return whatever value we put over here to the right. So when I call this cube function and I give it a 3, Python's going to go off, it's going to execute this function. When it sees this return statement, it's going to say, okay, I want to give a value back to whatever called this function, and it's going to return this value. Now, when I print out cube 3, it should print out the answer because we get an answer back. So when I play this, you'll see down here, it says 27, so we got the correct answer. So I could do this with anything. Why don't we cube 4 or something? So now I'll run this, and you can see we're constantly getting the correct answer back. So that's the basics of using this return statement. It allows us to return a value back to the caller. In other words, back to whatever's calling the function. So I just want to illustrate this point a little bit further. I'm going to come up here. I'm actually going to create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called result, and I'm just going to set it equal to cube 4. This variable result is going to store the value that gets returned from the cube function. So it's not going to store cube 4, it's going to store the value that gets returned from executing that function. So now if I came down here and printed out result, it's actually just going to print out 64 again because that's the value that it's storing. So this return statement can be really useful for getting information back from a function. We can use something like a parameter, like this 4 is a parameter, and we can give information to a function, and then we can use the return statement to get information back from a function. And I do just want to point out one more thing. I'm actually not able to put any code after this return statement. So if I came down here and tried to put like a print statement, this actually isn't going to work. So this is never going to get printed out. So if I just typed out like code right here, when we run this program, it's not going to type out code. That's because when I use this return keyword, it breaks us out of the function. So Python's going to go through, it's going to execute the code in the function. Whenever it sees this return keyword, it's just going to break back out and we're going to be done. So we'll never be able to reach this line of code. So that's the basics of using return statements, and you can return any data type you want. We could easily return like a string or a Boolean or an array. It doesn't really matter. You can return whatever you want. And a lot of times, in a lot of situations, you're going to want to get a value back from a function. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using if statements in Python. Now, if statements are a special structure in Python where we can actually help our programs to make decisions. So by using an if statement, I could execute certain code when certain conditions are true, and I could execute other code when other conditions are true. So basically, if statements allow our programs to respond to the input that they're given. So depending on the data that we're using in the program, our programs will be able to respond. So when certain data is certain values, we can do certain things. And when other data is other values, we can do other things. So your programs are essentially becoming a lot smarter. And actually, if statements are things that we as human beings deal with every day. So, as you go throughout your day, generally you're dealing with if statements all the time. So I want to kind of give you guys a brief introduction into if statements, and we'll talk about some of the common if statements that you'd see in everyday life. And then we'll go ahead and do a really awesome example to kind of like show you guys what if statements can do for us. So over here in my text editor, I just have this little text file, and in here I wrote out a bunch of if statements that a lot of people will encounter on a daily basis. So here's the first one. It says, I wake up, if I'm hungry, I eat breakfast. And so let's break this down a little bit. Up here it says, if I'm hungry, and this is a condition, right? This is either going to be true or it's going to be false, right? If it's true, I'm going to go ahead and eat breakfast, right? If it's false, I'm just going to skip whatever was in here and move on, right? So that's the basics of an if statement, right? We have a condition, in this case, if I'm hungry. If the condition's true, then we do the action, so we eat breakfast. Otherwise, we just skip it. So down here we have another one. It says, I leave my house. If it's cloudy, I bring an umbrella. Otherwise, I bring sunglasses. And so this one is a little bit more complex than the one we just looked at. You'll see we have our condition, right? It says if it's cloudy. If that condition's true, we're going to bring the umbrella. But in this case, if the condition's false, there's something else that we want to do. So in the case up here, if this condition was false, we just moved on. But now, if this condition's false, then we're going to go ahead and bring sunglasses. So that's another example of an if statement. It's a little bit more complex. Finally, I have one more down here, and this one's even more complex. It says, I'm at a restaurant. If I want meat, I order a steak. So if this condition's true, we order the steak. But if this condition is false, then we're going to move on, and we're actually going to check another condition. So I'm going to say, otherwise, if I want pasta, I order spaghetti and meatballs. This is another condition. If this condition's true, we get the spaghetti. If it's not true, then finally we're going to move on down here and we'll just default to ordering the salad. So all three of these if statements are valid if statements. It's just they get more and more complex as we go down the list. So hopefully that's, can kind of wrap your head around what if statements are. We're basically specifying conditions. If those conditions are true, we're going to do certain things. And if those conditions are false, we can do other things, or we can check other conditions. All right, so let's head over to our Python file and we'll start writing some actual Python. So in here in my app.python file, I want to create an if statement. And I'm going to show you guys a very basic if statement in this tutorial. And then in the next tutorial, we're going to look at some more advanced if statements. And so what I want to do is create a Boolean variable. So I'm going to create a Boolean variable that's going to store whether or not the user is a male. So it's just going to be called is_male. and I'm gonna set this equal to true because I'm a male. So we have this Boolean variable, right? And right now we have it set equal to true. I can actually use an if statement to check to see what the value of this variable is, and if it's true, I can do something. So if I want to use an if statement, all I have to do is just type out if, and then I just need to type out a condition. So basically I would have to type out like something that's going to be true or false. Like for example, in the other page we were specifying like if I'm hungry or if it's cloudy. Here we're just going to check to see if is male. So in other words, if the person is male. And so remember, this has to be it has to be able to be reducible to a true or a false value. So in our case, we're just using a Boolean because that's like the easiest thing we can do. So I said if, I specified my true or false condition. Now I want to just type a colon. And what I want to do now is make a new line. And so anything that I put below this with an indentation is actually going to be executed when that condition's true. So I could put print, and down here I could just put you are a male. And now you'll see what happens when I run this program. It's going to go down here and it's going to say you are a male. But if I changed is male to false, so instead of this being true, I just change it to false, now all of a sudden it's not going to print anything. So it's just going to be blank down here. That's because this condition wasn't true. So anything that I put below this if declaration and that has an indentation like that is going to be executed when the if statement is true. We can also use another keyword in Python, which is called else. And else is basically going to be like otherwise. So you remember before we said, if it's cloudy, I'll bring an umbrella. Otherwise, I'll bring sunglasses. Well, this is going to be like our otherwise. So I can say down here, else. And now anything that I put below else is going to get printed out when that condition isn't true. So why don't we just put, you are not a male. So now we're able to cover both of the situations for this variable. If it's false, we can cover that situation. So it says, you are not a male. If it's true, we can cover that situation as well. So it'll say you are a male. So that's pretty cool. But we can also make these more complex. And actually, before I talk about that, you can put as much code as you want inside of an if statement. So I could have like, dozens of lines of code if I wanted. I'm just giving you guys a very simple example. So why don't we make this more complex, and I'm going to add another variable into the mix. So I'm going to add another, Boolean attribute into this mix. I'm going to make another variable called is tall, and we're going to set this equal to true as well. So now I have two variables in the mix. Let's say I wanted to write an if statement that will check both of those variables. So I could write an if statement that's like if they're male and they're tall, or if they're male and they're not tall, or if they're not male and they're tall. Like I could write out a bunch of if statements to check the combination of these variables. And so the way I can do that is by using one of two keywords. So the first keyword I want to show you guys is the or keyword. So I can come over here and I can say if is male or is underscore tall. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to say if the person is either male or if they're tall, then we want to do something. So this is only going to be true when one of these values is true, when one or both of those values is true. So down here we could actually put, instead of you are a male, we could put you are a male or tall or both. That's going to be more appropriate. And then down here we would say you are neither male nor tall. And that's because if we execute the code inside of this else, that means that both of these guys are false, right? So I'm saying if they're male or they're tall, we're going to execute whatever is in here. Otherwise, that means they're neither male nor tall. We're just going to execute this down here. So let me show you guys how this works. I'll click play, and these are both true. So it's going to say you are a male or tall or both. If I was to set one of these to false, so let's set is male equal to false. Now, it's still going to say you are a male or tall or both. But if I set them both equal to false, now it's going to say you're neither male nor tall. So that's kind of the basics of using the OR operator. And there's another operator we can use which is called AND. And basically it's similar to OR, except both of these conditions have to be true. So this is basically saying if the person is male and they're also tall, then we're going to execute whatever's in here. So we could actually change this text to say you are a tall male, because we know for a fact that if this is getting executed, they're both male and tall. We can also change this print statement down here. This could say you are either not male or not tall or both. So you can see it's basically just saying that you're either not one of them or you're not both of them. So we click the play button and you'll see because they're both false, it's gonna say you are either not male or not tall or both. But if I make them both true, now it's gonna say you are a tall male. If I was gonna make one of these false though, so let's make is tall false, now it's not gonna execute this first print statement, it's gonna execute the one inside of the else. So it'll say you are either not male or not tall or both. So that's the basics of and OR, and you'll be using those a lot as you use your if statements. But there's actually one more thing we can do. We can add in some more conditions. So up here I'm checking if they're male and they're tall, but what if I wanted to check if they're male and they're not tall? So if they're like a short male. I can use another keyword in Python called else if, or really it's just typed out ELIF, and it stands for else if. And after this we can put another condition. So over here, I'm going to check to see if they're male and they're not tall. So I'm going to say else if male is male, and now I can type in not tall. And the way I can do that is by saying not and open and close parentheses and saying is tall. And basically when I use this not function, it's going to negate whatever is inside of here. So if this was true, it's going to make it false. And if this was false, it's going to make it true. So basically that'll tell us whether or not they're tall. And then I'm going to use a colon, and now down here, inside of here, we're basically just going to type out any of the code that we want to happen when this condition's true. So down here we can just print out you are a short male. And there's actually one more condition that we want to check for, which would be if they're not male and they're tall. So we can make one more else if, and I'm actually just going to copy this guy and we'll paste it down here. And so I want to say if not is male and is tall. So now we're checking to see if they're male and, or if they're not male and they're tall. So here we could say you are not a male but are tall. So essentially here we have an if statement that's going to cover every single condition for these two variables. So in every single situation of the two values of these variables, we're going to be able to print something out for it. So if I made both of these true, it's basically going to tell us you are a tall male. If I make is male false, it's going to tell us you are not a male but are tall. If I made is male true and is tall false, then it's going to tell us you are a short male. And if I made both of these false, it's going to tell us you are either not male or not tall or both. And actually we need to change this. So this should say you are not a male and not tall. So that would be a better printout for that situation. So you can basically see how we can use ifs, else ifs, and else in order to help our program to make decisions and really to respond to the different data in our programs. So I'm able to respond to every combination of the values for these two variables, and that's really cool. So in this example, we were just using simple Boolean variables, but in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how you can actually use something called comparison operators. So we could compare like two numbers or two strings, and we could use those as our conditions. But for now, I think this is a good introduction into if statements. So I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you some more about if statements in Python. More specifically, we're going to be looking at using comparisons inside of our if statements. So if you're following along with the course, in the last tutorial, I talked to you guys about just the basics of if statements, and we used a couple different Boolean variables. And depending on the values of those Booleans, we were able to do certain things. In this tutorial, we're going to look at another way to use if statements, which is with comparisons. So instead of just using Boolean values, we can actually compare different values. So like I could compare a couple numbers, or I could compare a couple strings, and depending on the results of those comparisons, we can do certain things. So this is going to be pretty cool, and this is really going to give you guys a full understanding of what you can do with if statements. So for this tutorial, I actually want to create a Python function, and this function is going to give us the maximum number that we pass into it. So this function is going to take 3 parameters as input, and it's going to print out the biggest number that we give it. So let's create this function. I'm just going to say def, and I'm just going to call it max num, and inside of these parentheses, I'm going to specify that I want 3 parameters as input. So I'm going to say num1, num2, and num3. So basically, we're passing it 3 numbers, and this function will return the largest of the 3. So in order to figure out which of these numbers is the largest, we're going to have to use an if statement. So I can say if, and over here I need to specify a condition, right? So I need to put like a true or a false value. And so what we can actually do is we can compare these different numbers. So I could say if num1 is greater than or equal to num2, and num1 is greater than or equal to num3. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm comparing these different numbers. So I'm saying if the first number is greater than or equal to the second number. And this is a comparison. So when you think about it, when we compare these 2 numbers, we're going to end up with a true or a false value, right? Num1 is either greater than or equal to num2, or it's not. It's actually a Boolean value, right? It's either true or it's false. Same thing over here. The result of this comparison is either true or it's false. So technically, I'm putting a true or false value in there. I'm just getting that true or false value by using a comparison. And you'll notice over here, we're using something called a comparison operator. And basically, this is just like how we want to compare them. So we're saying like greater than or equal to in this case. So down here, if this whole condition is true, in other words, if the results of these 2 comparisons end up being true, then we know that num1 is the biggest, so I can just return num1. I can say return num1. But we also want to check some other conditions, so I can say elif, and now I want to do some other comparisons. So I'm going to say else if num2 is greater than or equal to num1, and num2 is greater than or equal to num3. So I'm doing essentially what I did up here, except for num2. So again, I'm comparing these different numbers, and this is going to end up being a true or a false value depending on the result of the comparison. So down here again, we can just return num2, because if all of this is true, that means we're going to end up returning num2. And then finally, we can just say else. So if num1 isn't the biggest and num2 isn't the biggest, then we can pretty much assume that num3 is the biggest. So now we have our function. So down here, I'm actually just going to call this function. So I'm just going to say, actually, I'll print out the result. So I'll say max num, and we'll pass in like 3, 4, 5. So we're basically calling that new function that we just made. And I'm going to go ahead and run this program. So you can see down here in the output, we printed out 5 because that was the biggest. If I was to change this middle one to the biggest, so we make the middle one 40, now it'll be able to take on that situation. And finally, I can make this like 300, and it'll be able to handle that. So no matter which number, num1, num2, or num3 ends up being the biggest, it's able to tell us without a problem. So these comparisons are a really common way to make if statements. And a lot of times you're going to want to be comparing different values. inside of Python. So over here, we're comparing numbers, but we could also compare strings. So I could easily make these both like, I could make this like dog, and I can make this dog, and I could say a different operator. So I could say like this double equal sign would mean equal. So I could basically say like, if this string is equal to that string. So you can basically like compare all different data types. I could compare numbers, strings. You could also compare Booleans. So once again, these are comparison operators, and this one is greater than or equal to, but there's a bunch of other comparison operators we can use. So the most basic is just going to be a double equal sign, and that basically checks to see if the two values are equal. So it'll say like, if number 1 is equal to number 2. We can also say not equals, and this exclamation point will basically mean not equal. So it's if num1 is not equal to num2. We also have greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. And those are kind of all of the operators, or all the, the basic comparison operators that you're going to be using in Python. So using comparisons is really awesome, and there's going to be tons and tons of situations inside of Python where you're going to want to compare different values. So these can be extremely useful. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about building a calculator in Python. Now, if you've been following along with this course, you'll know that in the beginning of the course, we actually created a very basic calculator. Basically, the user could just enter in 2 numbers, and our calculator would add the numbers together and spit out the answer. In this tutorial, I want to show you guys how to build a more advanced calculator. So this calculator is going to be able to perform all of the basic arithmetic operations. So we can add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And will actually allow the user to specify which one of those they want to do. So the user will enter in a number. They'll enter in whatever operator they want to use, so plus, minus, divide, multiply, and then they'll enter in the second number and we'll perform the operation for them. So this is going to be pretty cool, and it's going to show you how we can use if statements in like a practical application. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is get input from the user. So I'm going to create 3 variables, one for the first number, one for the second number, and one for the operator. And we'll basically store the values that the user inputs into those variables. So the first one will just be num1. And I'm going to set this equal to input, and we're going to give this a prompt. So I'll say enter first number. And here's actually the thing is, whatever the user enters, we're going to want to convert it into a number. So generally in Python, when we get input from the user, no matter what they put in, it just gets converted into a string. But we don't want a string because we're going to have to be adding or subtracting or multiplying these numbers together. So whenever they enter in the number, I just want to immediately convert it to an actual like number data type instead of a string. So what I can do is I can actually say float, and I can surround this entire input tag with parentheses. And now what this is going to do is it's going to immediately convert whatever the user inputs into a float. Now that's going to mean that they're going to have to insert a number, otherwise we'll get an error. But for the most part, this should work out for us. So I'm actually just going to copy this guy, and we'll go ahead and paste it over here, and we'll paste it one more time. So we're basically just trying to get 3 pieces of input from the user. So the second thing we want to get is the operator. So I'm just going to say OP for operator, and I'll actually get rid of this float because we want to keep this as a string, and I'll just say enter operator. So that's going to be like plus, minus, multiplication, whatever. And then finally down here we'll get num2, and again we're going to want to convert this to a float. So I'll say enter second number. So now basically what we're doing is we're getting the first number, we're getting the operator, and we're getting the second number from the user. So what we need to do now is we need to figure out what is inside of this OP. In other words, we need to figure out what operator the user was trying to do. So are they trying to do addition? Are they trying to do subtraction? Like, we want to figure that out. So we can use an if statement in order to figure that out. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm basically just going to create an if statement. So I'm going to say if, and we want to check a condition. So I'm basically going to check to see if this operator is equal to a plus sign. So I can say if OP equals plus sign. And now if the operator is equal to plus sign, I'm just going to print out num1 plus num2. But let's say that instead of a plus sign, they entered in something else. So we can say elif OP is equal to, and now we'll check if it's a minus sign. And so here we'll just print num1 minus num2. And actually I forgot to put a colon here. So we can just do these for everything. So now we can say elif OP is equal to division, and here we'll just divide the two numbers, so I can print out num1 divided by num2. And finally we'll do the same thing for multiplication. So I'll say elif OP is equal to asterisk, and we'll just print out num1 times num2. All right, so basically over here we have every condition, but I also want to put in an else statement. So in the case that the user enters in an operation that's not like one of the 4 that we specified up here, I just want to throw an error. So I'm just going to say OP, or actually we just say else, and here we'll just print out like invalid operator. All right, so this if statement should give us everything we want. Basically, I'm just checking to see if it's equal to a plus sign, a minus sign, a division sign, or a multiplication sign. And depending on which one it's equal to, we'll do a different operation. So let's go ahead and run this and see how we do. So I'm gonna run this program, and it says enter first number. Let's enter 5. Enter an operator, so why don't we just do addition and enter a second number. Let's do 23. So now it prints out the answer, 28. So our calculator actually works. Let's try another operator just to make sure. So we'll do 6, and why don't we multiply it by, I don't know, 5.23. So now we go off and we do the multiplication, and looks like we got our answer. So our calculator seems to be working. And so basically all we did was we got the input from the user, and then we used if statements to figure out what they wanted to do, right? So we could check to see if they wanted addition. We could check to see if they wanted subtraction or division or multiplication. And we could also check to see if they entered in an invalid operator. So actually, why don't we try that too? So I'll enter in like 5, and now we'll just enter in like an open and closed parentheses and a 4. So you can see here it's able to tell, like the program's smart enough to know that that's not a valid operator. So these if statements can be really powerful, and we can use them in combination with getting the user input to create a little calculator. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using dictionaries in Python. Now, a dictionary is a special structure in Python which allows us to store information in what are called key value pairs. So essentially, I can just create a bunch of these different key value pairs, and then when I want to access a specific piece of information inside of the dictionary, I can just refer to it by its key. So the word dictionary is actually pretty appropriate here. If you guys are familiar with a normal dictionary, in a normal dictionary, you'd have a word, and then you'd have a definition associated to that word. So in this situation, the word would be the key. In other words, the word is what like uniquely identifies it inside of the dictionary, and then the value would be the actual definition. So this is going to make more sense once we start working with this, but I just wanted to give you guys a quick introduction. So in this tutorial, I want to create a little program that will allow us to convert a 3-digit month name into the full month name. So I could convert, for example, like JAN to January, or I could convert MAR into March. Like, I want to be able to have a program that can do that for us. And that's actually a pretty good use case for a dictionary. So we're actually going to create a dictionary, and I'm going to show you guys how we can do that. So the first thing we need to do in creating a dictionary is just give it a name. So I want to give this a specific name. So I'm just going to call this month conversions. And now I just want to set this equal to an open and closed curly bracket. So whenever we create a dictionary in Python, we're always going to want to create it inside of these open and closed curly brackets. And so inside of the dictionary, now we can start defining what are called key value pairs. So I can define a key and then I can give it a corresponding value. And the way that we can do that is just by typing out the key and then typing out the value. So in our case, we're converting 3-digit month names into the full month names. So I would want to type out, for example, JAN, and then I can type a colon, and I want to type out the value I want to associate with it. So we could say January. I could basically do this for every combination. So I could say like FEB, and this would be February. And actually, after each one of these, we're going to need to put a comma. So I could do the same for March. You could say MAR. So essentially what I can do is I can specify an entry inside of this dictionary for each one of these. So this over here would be the key, and this over here would be the value. And here's one thing is all of these keys have to be unique. So if I was to come down here and change this to JAN, this is actually going to give us a little warning. So you can see down here it says dictionary contains duplicate keys. That's a no-no when we're creating dictionaries. So you always want to make sure that the keys are unique. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create one of these for each one of the months, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. All right, so I've gone ahead and created an entry for all 12 of the months. So now we have a bunch of unique keys, and each one of those keys is associated with a different value. So this is the basics of creating a dictionary. Is we have a bunch of these different key value pairs, and now what we can actually do is we can access them from inside of this dictionary. So if I wanted to access a specific key or a specific value, all I have to do is come over here, and I'm actually just going to print it out onto the screen so we can see it. All I have to do is refer to the dictionary by name, so it's just called month conversions. And there's actually a bunch of different ways that I can access these month names. So I could access different entries inside of this dictionary. The first way is just by making a open and close square bracket. And inside here, I can just type in one of the keys. So for example, inside here, I could type in NOV. And what this should do is it should give us back the full name for November. So when I print this out, you'll see that we get back down here, November. So I could do the same thing for any of these. We could say like MAR, and now we should get March back. So I'm able to refer to the key, and it's going to go into the dictionary, and it's going to give me the value that's associated to that key. There's actually another way we could do this too. So I could say month conversions dot get, and inside of here I could also pass in the name of a key. So I could pass in like DEC, and now we'll be printing out December. And what's cool about using this get function is I can actually specify a default value that I want to use if this key is not found. So there's going to be certain cases when we're dealing with dictionaries where you're going to put in a key that might not necessarily map to a value inside of the dictionary. So you'd put in an invalid key. So let's just try to do that. So I'll just put like LUV. That's not a month abbreviation. So when I try to run this, you'll see we get this none down here. And in a lot of cases, you're going to want to create some sort of a default value. So if I'm in this situation where I have a key that's not mappable to any values inside of this dictionary, I can actually pass it a default value. So inside this .get function, I can make a comma, and now I can pass in like a default value